Adjunct Professor Moran, Microeconomics, 112. In this session, we're going to discuss the elasticity of resource demand. Okay. The elasticity of resource demand is measured by the percentage change in the quantity of resource hired divided by the percentage change in the price of that resource. The higher the price, since demand is a negative relationship between price and quantity, the higher the price of a resource, the less quantity will be demanded of that resource. We want to measure that and see how responsive the change in quantity is to the change in price. We're talking about basically how steep a demand curve is. Very steep is inelastic, less steep is elastic, keeping in mind that all demand curves have an elastic range and an inelastic range. The inelastic range of a relatively elastic curve is on the lower right. The elastic range will be relatively larger. We did this in the chapters on supply and demand. A very inelastic demand curve has most of the curve as inelastic and the upper left as elastic only. Okay. What we're talking about here is, will a small change in wage cause a large change in quantity demanded of labor, wage quantity, or will that same change in wage cause a very small change in the quantity demanded of labor? How responsive is quantity of an input, like labor, given a change in the wage rate? Very responsive or not very responsive? Very responsive, not very responsive. It turns out that the elasticity of demand for an input has three determinants: substitutes, product, and percentage of total cost of that input. The more substitutes there are for an input, if its wage rate goes up, there'll be a large quantity fall off demanded of it because the employer will seek to use the less expensive resource. But if a resource goes down in price and there are many substitutes, then the employers will substitute away from the other resource to this one, resulting in a large change in quantity demanded of the resource. If there are no substitutes for this input, then an increase in the wage rate will lead to a very small change in the quantity demanded of that resource. And a fall in the price of that resource will lead to a small change in the quantity demanded, since there were no substitutes there, using what they need. Another determinant of the elasticity of demand of a resource is the elasticity of the product. So if a product goes on sale and many more of it is sold, then you'll need many more resources, inputs, to produce that. But gasoline, for example, never goes on sale, and so the demand for the inputs for gasoline is relatively inelastic. So the demand, again, remember that demand for an input is derived from the demand from the product it makes. So the more elastic the demand is for the product, the more elastic demand curve for the input will be also. And the less elastic demand curve for the product is, the less elastic the demand for the input will be as well. Finally, the third determinant of elasticity demand for a resource is the percentage of total cost. All right. The more a resource represents the total cost of a firm, the greater it's going to be its elasticity, because a small change in the price of that resource will have a tremendous impact on the cost of the firm, and as a result, its profitability. So an increase in the price of workers, if workers are a significant part of total cost, will cause the firm to have a significant decrease in the quantity demanded of that input. But if a resource is a relatively small percentage of the total cost of a firm, an increase in the price of that resource may lead to very little falling off of that resource. This could be used to explain why corporations fight giving workers even a small increase, because workers are a significant percentage of a firm's total costs, and a small increase in the wage will lead to a large decrease in the quantity demanded, because it has a significantly larger impact. It has a significant impact on total profitability. But when you come to corporate executives who get paid, say, $17 million a year, although $17 million is a lot of money, in the grand scheme of the costs of a business, that may not be that much. So they can get larger increases in wages without a fall off in the demand for corporate executives, because they overall are so few in number, they represent a small percentage of the total pay or costs of a company. And as we remember from the beginning of our chapter, the demand for resources is important because it determines the wage rate of the various factors of production, whether it's labor or entrepreneur, and there are ethical issues to be considered when it comes to the flow of income to the different resources, say entrepreneur and labor. So in this video we discuss the elasticity of demand for a resource, how elastic, how changeable is quantity of input demanded given a change in its cost. Very elastic, significant change in the quantity given a change in the wage rate. Inelastic, relatively small change in the quantity demanded of an input given a change in the wage rate. In our next video, we're going to discuss a two-input problem, capital and labor, and how do we decide on the optimal combination of capital and labor.